We're looking at new polling out of Texas and which Democratic presidential hopeful fares the best against Donald Trump as it stands right now.
We are back with political reporter Julia Manchester and Real Clear Politics reporter Philip Wegman. Great to have you guys.
See you guys.
All right, so Texas poll overall was interesting. Democratic primary numbers had Bernie leading, Biden close behind, and then Warren, and then Bloomberg. But what also caught my eye here, Philip, were the Trump versus these candidates head-to-heads. Now, you always want to take these with a grain of salt. We're, a long way from the general election, et cetera, and Texas is still a bit of a dream for Democrats. But interesting to me, of all the candidates, the person who does best against Donald Trump in the state of Texas, real America, is Bernie Sanders, the Democratic Socialist.
Yeah. And this is Texas.
Yeah.
That's the takeaway here. This polling would not be unusual elsewhere, but it's in Texas, which is, deep red. Obviously, there have been a lot of pipe dreams that someday it's going to go blue, but maybe that might happen eventually. I think that shows how much of a good job that Bernie Sanders has done in the Lone Star State. And this is also concerning for Joe Biden because this was another firewall for Super Tuesday. He led there. Now, at least according to this poll, he does not.
Yeah, that's the thing. I'm from Texas, Julia. It's a very, very diverse population, but it does make sense to me because of Bernie's strengths with Latinos in particular.
Right.
He's got, we were talking about this in the break. What is it, the $21 million that Latinos have given to candidates? $8 million of that went to Bernie Sanders. There's a huge Latino population, obviously, in Texas. But not only that, there's a lot of new voters who have moved to the state from California, very much people who are Bernie people to begin with.
Right, and we know that Bernie Sanders has a very pro-immigration message. He's pushed back on a lot of the Trump administration's immigration policies and such. And I think, in general, coming out of Iowa and New Hampshire, Bernie just has a lot of momentum in terms of electability. A lot of these voters in states that you would think would go to a more moderate Democrat or a more centrist Democrat, I think they're starting to take stock of the results and kind of think, okay, who is most likely to beat Donald Trump? Because this is at the top of a lot of voters' priorities list. And for a lot of these voters, I would say Bernie Sanders is really starting to come top of mind.
Yeah. It's interesting what Sagar says, Philip, because I hadn't necessarily thought of this before. Sanders' strength with Latinos, we covered the Morning Consult poll that has him at almost 50% with Latinos, which is astonishing, is not just a strength of the primary, that's also a strength of the general election, especially in a place like Texas, where, it's Democrats sort of lazily think of this as a community that belongs to them, but a lot of these voters are swing voters that can go back and forth between the Republican and Democratic parties.
Right, and earlier in the segment, you said that voters felt like they finally had permission to vote for Bernie Sanders. I think that is something that's happening right now, because that Latino support, like you just laid out, it's also an argument for the general election. And after he won Iowa, after he won New Hampshire, I think there are other voters who are saying, well, I liked him before, but I was worried, because the top concern of just about every Democratic primary goer is electability. They're not just concerned about purity. They want someone who's going to win come next November.
About Latinos in Texas in particular. These are not monolith voters. We're talking about 40, sometimes 50% of them who vote GOP. And so it's not, it's not how Washington tends to think about it. So it is interesting from that perspective. But we should throw up the Texas numbers writ large about who is doing well in the state. And you basically see that Bloomberg is making, he's making some inroads within Texas. And I think that what he's doing, Julia, is trying to buy off so many of the, he's trying to buy off, the consultants and the operatives, because people don't know this, but Texas is one of the most expensive states in America to campaign in.
Interesting.
And it's interesting because Bloomberg has actually pulled a lot of consultants and operatives out of retirement.
Yes.
And he's getting a lot of big names onto his campaign, who have worked in previous campaigns, and he's really staffing up in that way. So they essentially very much know what they're doing. But one thing we haven't brought up, and I think in terms of getting the young vote, Bloomberg is actually partnering with a lot of meme companies, Meme 2020, Jerry Media. And, we roll our eyes, but to be honest, looking through Instagram, it's very clever. It's all over Instagram. His ad buys are massive, and he's putting himself top of voters' minds.
In conversation.
Exactly.
Which is all that matters.
Interesting, though, in these head-to-head matchups, Bloomberg doesn't do that well against Trump here. He's down by 5, whereas, both Biden and Warren at this point, Philip, are at least somewhat outperforming him in the head-to-head matchup. So this idea, I think, that voters have Especially Democratic voters have been fed this line for so long that the most electable person is whoever is the furthest right, which, how did that work out for Hillary Clinton? It doesn't seem to be, at least at this point, really reflected by the polls or reflected by reality.
I think that's also why we've seen Mike Bloomberg try to pick fights with Donald Trump. We saw the tweet where he was talking about how, the social circle in New York doesn't actually like the president of the United States. Okay, well, that doesn't really matter other than he wants to continue to get on Donald Trump's nerves. He probably likes the nickname Mini Mike because it keeps him in the conversation. And he
You know what it does? It elevates it.
It elevates
makes it
him.
show that he drives Trump crazy,
Yeah.
and that helps his white suburban voters.
If Trump fears you, then that's good for you.
Well, he should be careful with that because there's also video floating around of him talking about what a big fan of Donald Trump he is. So
Oh, yes, yeah.
that cuts both ways.
He said, we know many of the same people, and he's like, I'm a big fan of Donald Trump.
Right,
This
I
is
think
in
he called him
2011.
iconic. Right.
Yeah.
Those things can
True.
come back and bite you.
All right.
All right. Thank you,
Thanks,
guys.
guys.
Great to have you both.
Thanks so much.
Next week on Rising, we're going to take a talk with a member of the Sunrise Movement about how their organizing effort paid off in early primary victories for Bernie Sanders.
And Peter Hasson describes his new book on big tech's war on conservatives. It's called The Manipulators. Looking forward to that. Everybody have a great weekend. We'll be posting content over the weekend. Always appreciate you all. We'll see you soon.